precedence over deep consideration for the ethical and safety implications of adopting these datafied systems?
Yeah, and most of us may have been using some level of online tools in our classrooms or in our work in centers for teaching and learning beforehand, but I know I've been doing online education for 20 years, and the pandemic still created this significant increase in my students' onlineness, in everyone kind of being online. And the part that we haven't talked about that is not just, are we experiencing this arc of online education, which is the way that my institution is framing it, but we're also experiencing an arc of increased surveillance and increased data extraction that all of the work that Sam and I are going to talk to you about came out of a realization that we aren't really talking about this with educators and with students. So there is a significant change here in higher education and what it means to be involved in the work of what we call the classroom, right? When I was growing up, the classroom really represented actually a physical four walls, and this Fisher-Price toy was the peak toy of my childhood. You could carry the little school along to a friend's house potentially, or I would go to a friend's house to play with it. But now our classrooms are complex platforms that we don't necessarily fully understand or have control over. And the reason that that matters, I think, particularly for educators, is because we're in a knowledge profession, but we don't necessarily have complete knowledge about what constitutes not just the social contract of our classroom, but literally the infrastructure of our classroom at this point. And the imaginary that higher ed represents, right? The idea of public good, of learning, of, there's also in higher ed also some other pieces like, should it be for workforce training? Are we mostly as faculty deeply concerned with ideas of prestige or rigor? I'm not necessarily in favor of all of these pieces that are represented in the little colored bars on the left bottom of your screen. But when I talk to faculty colleagues, both in our institution and elsewhere in the world, these are some of the things that come up around what it means to be an educator in higher education. And the idea of our systems being extractive is not one of the pieces that comes up. We tend to think that we understand our role as faculty in shared governance. But the piece that Sam and I are beginning to kind of do some both research into and also information sharing and awareness raising about is the idea that datafication, the idea that all of our platforms are capturing data, extracting data, surveilling us in some way, and we don't know who's watching, is a bit of a Trojan horse into the higher ed imaginary, or the idea of what it is that we do in this field.
So with the technology shifts we've had, it always used to be a concern for the future. We always worried about surveillance and privacy for the future concerns, but at this point in time, it is a concern now because mass datafication represents a critical change in higher education as a sector, and it brings with it surveillance, privacy, and discriminatory issues that amplify and increase equity issues within the sector. So critically acknowledging datafied changes in the educational sector does allow the opportunity to explore new avenues of learning about the risks and the impacts of surveillance.
Sorry, I did not mean to move that slide forward on you, Sam. I apologize. I do love that tweet that was captured there in the screenshot, because sometimes what we datafy, what we can count, becomes what we think it is that we're meant to do. And that's, data is not necessarily entirely a negative. I'm sure many of us use some level of learning analytics in our work, find perhaps some value in the things that we can get from our datafied platforms, but they risk reducing what our focus is on to the data that we have. And they also bring with them, in that Trojan horse sense, these three issues of surveillance, privacy, and significant discrimination, because so many of the platforms and tools themselves are fundamentally at this point either using facial recognition technologies that are literally not good at recognizing both folks with darker skin and just female faces. So if you are a Black female, the chance that facial recognition technology will misrecognize you is significantly higher than if you are a white male face. They are trained and coded on a population that doesn't represent the population of the world or the population of many of our students. This is one example that many of you may have realized over the pandemic. How many of you, just in the chat, I'll open that back up again. How many of you were kind of struggling to find, when everything went online, ways to assess learning that avoided or didn't necessarily force timed tests online? Was that an issue that any of you were struggling with during the pandemic, either in your as teachers or as workplaces? Laura, you've been happily ungrading. That's excellent. The work that I do is in a faculty of education, so I don't do a lot of testing, and I realized that I did not have to, therefore, perhaps adjust into the ways that some of my faculty colleagues did. But a lot of folks were really deeply tied to traditional timed test assessments. And so are some of the large kind of public tests that are cultural markers for getting to the next phase of a profession. So things like the LSATs for a law school, or MCATs for med school, or the bar exam, which is what allows people to practice after law school as lawyers. And so this young woman, she had completed her law school. She was pregnant, and she had been waiting for some time to take her bar exam. It was delayed due to the pandemic. And the organizers of the bar exam, the conveners, chose to use a platform called Proctorio for to proctor the exam, meaning that she had to install a camera on her, or install a, the word that it's more than a platform, a whole infrastructure on her device that would surveil the room around her, and that did not allow her to move out of the screen of her window, of her camera sight, or even to keep her eye, to sort of move her eyes off of the focus of her computer. Now, if you think about yourself, right? I'm sure most of you have flicked your eyes away from your rapt attention to Sam and I over the last 5 or 10 minutes. But this is what Proctorio expects. This woman went into labor. Her water broke while she was taking her bar exam that she had waited months and months to take. It's high, high stakes in terms of her professional practice. So she's sitting there and her labor is beginning and she can't get up and leave. Now, if this was happening in a real space environment where you were a convener or an adjudicator of a face-to-face exam and a pregnant woman's water literally broke all over the chair and the floor, you would probably be like, hey, it's okay if you like want to go to the hospital. Can I get you a cab or something? But with the online platform, she just literally had to sit there and complete the exam. Part one, she went to the hospital and delivered a baby, and the next day had to take part two. And I agree with Laura that the exam is the fundamental problem. The problem with this arc and Trojan horse of datafication that's moving in on us is it's actually predatory on some of our perhaps least progressive or least learning focused practices as a sector. And it jumps in and says, hey, you have a problem adapting to what the internet is kind of putting out there for us. So let's solve that for you in a simple way that is not actually simple and creates a whole cascading series of other problems. And this is part of what we're seeing with datafication, that it is part of a digital incursion of corporate kind of interests looking to gain real footholds in higher education. And Sam and I's work focuses right now on some of the risks of that, which include some very egregious examples like this, but also just platforms that many of us cannot avoid using, even if we are not using them for what we might consider pedagogical practices that we could work around. Even if you're doing completely participatory work online, you still have to use platforms and may not be fully aware of the datafication impacts of them. So we've done a little bit of work on this. We've done 2 studies. The first was a survey in 2020, in the summer of 2020. I kind of realized everyone's online, and I'm wondering, what do we know as educators about these platforms that we're using? So I put this call out on Twitter. You'll notice, I think a lot of my colleagues are in humanities, social sciences, and education around the world. And so we definitely did have more participants from those parts of the higher ed sector, but we did have participants from a variety of places around the world, primarily North American, 339 responses. And the questions that we asked were really just 4 proxy questions. And they were around people's kind of knowledge, their practices, their beliefs around data and platforms in their teaching. We started there, and then in 2021, we are now doing a more in-depth study. So Sam's going to talk a little bit about our in-depth study.
Yeah, so when designing the in-depth 2020 follow-up qualitative comparative case study, we really wanted to investigate the 4 areas of inquiry represented by the proxy questions, just a little bit more in depth. So although the project is still in the analysis stage, our semi-structured interviews with 11 participants engaged us in conversations about their practices, knowledge, experiences, and perspectives in the context of their work in higher education, both prior to and during the pandemic.
Yeah, and you'll notice we wanted to make sure that we weren't just talking to sort of what here in North America we call tenure track educators, but rather folks who were positioned in different spaces within higher education. What we've been finding is we really don't know about data, and we're not talking about it. So our baseline question about knowledge was simply, do you know which country or countries house the servers and data for your current institutional LMS? I can put that question out to you folks. In the chat, feel free to share. There is no shame in not knowing. Do you know what country the servers are in? For us in Canada, this matters because if a platform that I'm teaching my students on is housed in the US, then the data that comes onto that platform is bound by United States privacy law, which is different from Canadian privacy law. I am not an expert in either, but I do want my students to be protected by at least the laws of the country that we are in. And it turns out that 66% of our respondents, or 2/3 of the folks who responded to us, didn't know where the servers or data were, even though 93% have taught with that LMS. And the proportion of this was definitely higher in the US, because of course, as the dominant, they don't necessarily see themselves, right? That they don't need to know what country the platforms are in because they assume they're in the US, and they often are. But for those of us outside the US, this can be important knowledge. Another finding that we found in terms of data practices, we wanted to know, do people read the terms of service and the privacy agreements of platforms before using them with students? Only 10% use or read the full terms of service more than 90% of the time. 60%, me included, read the full terms of service less than 10% of the time. This is not a condemnation or an indictment of educator practices. Those terms of service are not meant to be read. We've actually been in our interviews in the 2021 study, we've been talking with a law professor, and she said, even though I teach law, I still really can't keep on top and follow all of what's written in terms of service. So no, I don't think it's that people don't care. I think it's that we live in a culture where we're accustomed to clicking yes to have to get access to anything. And we as a sector in higher ed have not kind of banded together to put pressure on these platforms to make terms of service for educational technologies pedagogical in focus. We have not put pressure institutionally to ask for a, mini TLDR. What does this mean for you and your students version? The terms of service are meant to be legalese that kind of shut us out of the conversation.
So in our 2021 findings, the majority of our participants, even the ones responsible for educational technologies on their campuses, they indicated that the conversations about data and its implications were very rare. They consistently talked about placing trust in their institutions, and it's situated not just as an interpersonal employer-employee relationship, but within a broader nexus of ethical responsibility related to the idea of education as a public good. So in a lot of interviews and field notes, the perception that institutions have complex ethics-based responsibilities to students and faculty based in trust and public ideals emerged consistently, as did the conclusion that the sector and institutions have not yet enacted this responsibility sufficiently in relation to data risks and privacy issues. So we pulled a couple quotes from some of the interviews, and the real concerns that these educators are saying is really about the issue of critical change. Faculty are deeply engaged in what we do and who is concerned. However, there's a gap in the bridge between the trust relationship with their institutions. So, for example, Jason stated that all of this data is being collected, including on what faculty do, and even though to our knowledge it's not being used, the temptation to eventually use it could be weaponized against us. Susanna approached it more from a student perspective and stated that she's very aware of the datafied risks that her students must use to go to class, how that can be exported to systems like immigration control, and that poses significant risks and furthers the discriminatory issues that could arise from implementing these systems.
Yeah, so it's not that faculty don't care. It's simply that to an extent our knowledge is not around, and we are not being taught about how these things work. There are not sector-wide conversations, but people do care both about how it impacts them and how it impacts higher ed and how it impacts students.
We are currently in the process of coding our 2021 findings, and we've come to somewhat of a conclusion that there are significant barriers for educators, and then there's also beliefs of educators that are emerging in our data. So the main themes in the barriers is that there's a lack of knowledge and awareness. It's not necessarily that everyone is uninterested in the topic of data ethics and data privacy, but there's barriers to knowledge like the terms of service. And a lot of times we're just unaware. We're not taught to kind of look into that stuff because it is placed in trust. Like we have trust that the institution will read it for us, or they'll implement systems that are safe for us to use and travel down the line of institution to educators to students. There is also a disapproval and dissatisfaction theme. So there's an uncomfortableness with the shift to technology and these systems. A lot of individuals disagree with the current systems and practices because there's danger for students, danger for faculty, and they express a need for change, but are not quite sure where to start to get that change. And again, there's the institutional responsibility theme where they're passing on responsibility and stating that there's a lack of communication from the institution to the educators and faculty that then transmits to students. Main themes and beliefs are that there's a lot of educators that are currently happy with the current system because there's benefits in sort of automation and datafication, and makes their job a lot easier. And almost at the same time, what we know can't hurt us. So they're being complacent to avoid challenging the imaginary of education and risking scrutiny from their institution or colleagues for challenging this system that has been set in place. Datafication is beneficial for students and educator relationships, some find, because they're able to keep it very, the nuances are taken away and it's very just cut and clear data.
Yeah, particularly for folks whose work is content delivery, perhaps maybe more so than relationship building or participatory pedagogy, there can be some real value in for them as expressed in terms of, I think datafication enables them to kind of keep tabs on what their students are doing and ensure compliance. The challenge, of course, is that if we want higher education to be a corporate compliance system, then we are probably, once again, experiencing a critical change in what it means to be involved in higher education and losing some of the space where it does serve, for all of its flaws, its many flaws, a space outside the logic of business and the logic of media, right, that has this public good concept within our society. We did find that some of the folks involved in both of our studies, those who were most able to engage critically or confidently with data might be some of the folks who are here today, right? Who are more engaged in PD practices, in open practice, already involved in things like ungrading and deep pedagogical reflection about the power relations of the work that we do in education, and folks also who were familiar with or responsible for EdTech in their environments. So those are really the professionals who tend to be leading or pushing at the edges of this conversation. But it is difficult, even for folks who are engaged in those ways, to gain traction in their institutions, to actually kind of make change or even envision what it is that they are looking for in terms of where we go from here. There's a broad acceptance that datafication's happened, but what do we do next is the question. And basically, where Sam and I are landing, and we're just about to wrap up, our big message coming out of our research is faculty knowledge, right? And educators' kind of professional understanding of the work that we do is deeply undermined by this invisible layer of surveillance that we don't analyze critically of the systems that we are using. It is that Trojan horse that is coming in, and we need to be having institution-wide conversations across, not just leave it to IT, not that IT isn't doing a great job within the purview of IT of making sure that, you know, our systems are compliant to the terms of service that they have, but rather IT could be sitting down with centers for teaching and learning, with faculty, with students, with senior admin, having actual cross-table conversations about what does this mean for our institution and how do we boil this down so that we are constantly doing data literacy education for our populations about the platforms we choose to bring in and what they mean. And I think we can't even just download this entirely on individual institutions. We need to be having these conversations as a sector. So for those of us who are kind of at that maybe vanguard of folks who at least are more aware and talking about some of this stuff, I think one of the things that we can push for is more sector-wide conversations and the capacity to band together, perhaps make demands ultimately of these platforms. Look, we'll use these, we will sign your incredibly expensive contracts, but we would like to see clarity and protection and all of these pieces focused on what higher education does that is different from necessarily just a tool used in a business context. And so that is really the work that Sam and I are up to. And thank you very much for listening. And we would love to have a conversation about it for a few minutes. I think we have at least 5 minutes or so. Yes, like Zoom, Laura, good point. Absolutely.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I see the point that Danielle made about librarians. And I think that librarians also very much are a core part of the conversation in terms of the people who should be at that table for sure. Sorry about that exclusion. They're written in our paper. It was just me that didn't say it out loud. And I'll stop sharing.
Wow, thank you, Bonnie and Sam. That was amazing. I mean, there's a lot there, and you've kind of unpacked it in ways that are very accessible, and yet these conversations really need to be held, because every time you said something, there's such a process behind it, you know, and a whole kind of culture and practices. So it'd be really great to have a conversation. There are some things in the chat that you might want to pick up as well. But if anyone wants to put their hand up, go ahead now.
I am just seeing, and feel free, I'm seeing a question from Nicola about a link to the paper. So there is a paper out from the 2020 survey. We are still, like Sam said, coding and theming our 2021 data. So that is not written up yet, but I will share the 2020 paper that I worked on with another grad student. And Sam, if something else comes up while I'm looking for that, feel free to answer that. I see an interesting question from Amina that I would love to take on. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that while I go look for the paper.
Thoughts on student-facing dashboards to help them use their data for learning. I'm not 100% sure if I can answer that.
The idea of so if you as a graduate student, right, if you were engaging in a course and rather than the data just being sort of surveillance focused, collected, but you never see it, if it was fed back to you, this is how often you're engaged in your class, this is how many things you've participated in, this is how that fits the average for your class or your discipline. Would that have any value for you if you could kind of see your engagement quantum? I have some concerns, but also I can see how that could be interesting for folks.
I think it would depend on the person. I personally am the type of person that would want to see kind of where I fall. If you could see sort of like a median where, you know, you're on the lower end of engagement opposed to your other classmates, I would want to see something like that. But there are also, one of the things we talked about was educators being overwhelmed, especially with the pandemic burnout. And I feel like for students, the same thing, like you can give us the data, you can present it however you want to, but if we're just so overwhelmed with everything else, we're going to take it and get rid of it almost instantly. So it would really depend on the person and how much they care.
I agree. And I do think though, for some students, again, like the Twitter screen capture that said, first we wanted data about what the students were learning, and then we ended up drilling it down so that the students just became data. I worry that a student might over focus on what the information that could be communicated through data and maybe miss a lot of the deeper elements of what their faculty member might be trying to create as a learning experience for them. So I see potential in that, but I also feel like we would need to be, again, engaging in what we're not doing, which is building literacies around the limitations of what information to take from that. Laura, I see your hand is up. You go ahead. I'm just noticing Nicola's point about the racial bias piece, and I realize that alters and shifts from location to location, but all of this software both has encoded racial bias in how it works and also exists within the broader culture, which always has racial bias, gender bias, etc. Laura, you go ahead, and I'm going to put this paper in the...
I went ahead and shared a link too in the chat. I had a dramatic moment when I realized that this was happening with student data and data about me in Canvas a few years ago. So this was before the pandemic, but the then CEO of Instructure had made all these incredible public statements that Phil Hill, thank goodness, had reported in his blog about how great all this datafication is. The guy had no educational background or experience and couldn't read the room. And the more he talked about his goals, his thoughts of how there's all this money to be made from data and predictive algorithms, just the more outrageous it became. It was really kind of surreal for me because, I taught online for a long time. I'd, used the LMS in a minimalistic kind of way, but had never really thought about data in all these ways that Bonnie and Sam have just been talking about. So I definitely had that moment of awakening as an educator. And what I wanted to share here was how hard it is to have conversations, because at that time, I was a kind of leading member of the Canvas community online. I was a super active participant in the online Canvas community and blogging pretty much every day, and just, trying to get ideas about data literacy and pedagogy into that Canvas community, because it was a great community of educators. And I felt like, as a kind of, experimental person doing things like ungrading, I had a lot to offer to the community. And so when I started talking about data and how disturbing this was to me, I was asked to leave the community. They didn't kick me out. They just said I couldn't write about that anymore. So I could write about all the other stuff. All the other stuff was great and cool, and they liked that. I just couldn't write about data. Mm-hmm. And so I left the community and didn't write there anymore. And in some ways, it was kind of good for me, because I poured a lot of my energy as an educator into that community instead of writing at my own blog and on and on. But wow, I mean, so just, I've been through that trajectory that Bonnie's talking about. And when you wake up and realize the system that you're part of, for me, it was a Soylent Green moment. And I used a lot of Soylent Green memes at my blog when it happened, because I was just so shocked at the underside of what I'd been part of and hadn't known about. So not a question, just a comment, and just to say thank you for carrying on this work, because there's a long way to go.
Before my institution asks me to leave, basically. Yeah, no, I mean, there is, when you are talking about change that people have invested in, both financially and narratively, and there's a senior strata investment in, this is what we're doing, and there's a lot of buzzword bingo that gets hit with datafication, right? I sound like a great senior administrator when I start talking about optimizing our datafication of learning. That's risky. And the question that Kathy had mentioned about people who have huge classes, already huge classes, high stakes testing, grading are not super learning practices. They are functional and sometimes optimized management practices. And I recognize that we exist within that tension, not in an ideal. But I think that doubling down on systems that create significant harms and broader shifts without, just so that people don't have to grade so much, is a way that higher ed may be selling the farm to eventual corporate takeover through certifications of what we do, right? We can unbundle and dismantle what we do and sell it all to separate corporations, and then we literally won't have institutions anymore. And I think that's the risk that we take when we focus entirely on, but this is what I know how to do within the box of higher ed as I know it.
Kathy, sorry, Bonnie, Kathy has her hand up, so I just wanted to give her a chance if she wanted to speak before we wind up.
I have like kind of a question and a comment. Well, Laura, I too have felt the same thing at my institution. The more I brought up kind of, you know, issues that I had and talking about this whole idea of, you know, the business angle versus, you know, the learner and what the learner is actually there for. And, you know, what are they paying for, you know, to be victimized? I got shut out of a lot more things. But one thing that I've been thinking about is, you know, the core of putting learning together. And a lot of it, I think, is really within three kind of sectors: the faculty, the instructional designer, and the librarian. And the coming together of all three can really kind of have strength in numbers, because when you're just working with the one area, which I started at my institution as an instructional designer, and I got laid off, but they wanted me to come back and do this other role, which I did. And now I oversee librarians that don't work for us. It's just like a whole struggle. But when you have the three working together, I totally think that some of these conversations that Bonnie brought up and bringing these sectors together will have a bigger input. And so I just wanted to, you know, ask if anybody else is really feeling that way, if that can be one of the strategies that we use to combat this. Thank you for your time in this presentation.
Thanks so much. And that was just such a generative conversation. You know, we're actually doing this work as well. And I think, you know, it's sort of the experiences of individuals as well. And I think it's a conversation that can probably continue across MYFest in different